The protagonist staggered down to one knee, a dark rivulet streaking from his brow. He pressed fingers against his temple and whispered that his head hurt. He turned his palm upward and saw blood beading on his skin. Distant voices screamed urgent directions, and someone cried to guard the village. The door slammed open as armored guards burst in, weapons raised and boots pounding the floor. They shouted orders and rushed past him toward the street. The protagonist watched them move and felt a hollow confusion settle over him. The protagonist staggered to one knee, blood beading on his palm as he pressed his temple. Distant shouts rose and armored guards burst through the door, weapons raised and boots pounding the floor. The protagonist watched them move, confusion settling as some faces felt familiar. Coughs and choking cries cut through the noise. A guard reeled and slammed into the ground amid a spray of red. The impact drew every eye. A wolf-like silhouette filled a red panel, its jaws and posture blocking the light and drawing attention. The protagonist had fallen to one knee, clutching a bloody palm to his temple. Armored guards had burst in, shouts and boots filling the room. A guard collapsed in a spray of blood and drew every hostile gaze. Then a wolf-like beast filled a red panel, its stance bipedal and blocking the light. The protagonist recognized the creature instantly and felt certainty harden inside him. He looked at the fallen people and named their affiliation aloud. Those victims were from the Banta Black Ring, he realized with thin horror. The protagonist's memory blurred into a golden childhood scene where small voices debated a name. They called him Hands and urged haste as laughter and pleading filled the panel. The memory snapped to the present, and the protagonist convulsed and screamed. He clutched his head, and a raw cry tore from his throat. A quiet panel then wondered whether those were the body's memories or echoes. The protagonist steadied himself and spoke the names he had seen aloud. He named Jorsa and Bodin with flat certainty that removed all doubt. The protagonist's memory had named Jorsa and Bodin, then he steadied and peered outward. He examined the nearby roofs and half-burned square. He said the place aloud, Aram Village, the starting point of the Banta Black Ring. Smoke and toppled stalls filled the street, and a limp body lay near a fountain. A wolf-like silhouette appeared at the alley mouth and advanced with low growls. Its leap was sudden and teeth flashed. The protagonist cursed, felt pain sharpen his focus, and readied himself to meet the animal. The protagonist had remembered Jorsa and Bodin and then steadied to peer outward. He scanned nearby roofs and the half-burned square and named it Aram Village. Smoke filled the street, stalls lay toppled, and a limp body rested by the fountain. A wolf-like beast appeared at the alley mouth and advanced with low growls. It leapt, teeth flashed, and struck as he slid from the roof. Pain sharpened his focus, and he grabbed the ledge to stop his fall. He told himself he would die if panic took him and forced calm. He clenched his hand and set his jaw prepared to face the beast. The protagonist had steadied on the roof, eyes on the half-burned square below. He remembered Jorsa and Bodin and forced his breath steady. The beast burst from the alley, teeth bared and energy crackling around its jaws. It dove straight at him with a brutal lunge. He raised his pole and struck its chest to block the blow. The beast's teeth tore through his side, and a hot pain split him. He screamed, lost purchase, and tumbled to the stone. The pole spun out of his hands and sank into the ground, leaving dark blood on the paving. The protagonist lay on cold paving, clutching his side as blood soaked his shirt. He watched the alley while the beast drew nearer with claws scraping the stone. A single yellow eye fixed on him without blinking. Fear flared, then hardened into anger. He refused to die there. He forced slow breaths and told his body to move. He dragged his fingers toward the fallen pole across the floor. Pain lanced with each motion, but he kept straining forward. He begged himself to move and then cursed to force action. He screamed a raw command and tested whether he still had strength. The protagonist remained on the paving, clutching his side while his shirt darkened with blood. The beast had drawn nearer, its single yellow eye fixed without blinking. Pain tested him, but anger held fast. He forced slow breaths and tried to move. The beast loomed and bared its teeth. He screamed a raw curse. A red-haired guard shouted hands, then lunged. The guard swung a heavy pole, cleaving air and striking the beast. The blow sent the creature stumbling back. The guard rushed to the fallen figure and asked whether Hands was all right. The protagonist stayed on the paving, clutching his side as his shirt darkened with blood. The guard grew furious and berated him for failing to act, shouting over the wind. The beast stepped closer, its yellow eyes flaring and mouth split into a snarl. The guard spat words of contempt, then charged, hefting his pole in both hands. He swung with raw force and struck the creature across the skull. The blow staggered the beast and tore flesh, spraying blood. The guard rushed forward to aid the fallen figure and call for Hands. The protagonist stayed on the paving, holding his side as blood soaked his shirt. The guard berated him and then charged the beast with sword and shield. He shouted "Die" and struck the creature across the skull. The blow tore flesh and sent dark blood flying. The beast collapsed, staggering beneath the guard's weight. The guard rushed to the fallen figure and shouted for Hands while villagers watched in horror. Flames and smoke began to swell over the rooftops as the street filled with ash. A lone figure stood on the carcass, and a voice called, "Hey." The protagonist remained on the pavement, clutching his wound as blood darkened his shirt. Ash drifted through the street while villagers watched from doorways and rooftops. The guard stepped forward and barked a name to the wounded man. The protagonist met the guard's eyes and answered that he was not Hands. The guard scoffed, called him a hindrance, and accused him of endangering others. He grabbed the protagonist's collar and demanded the location of the storage. The street pulsed with tension as the wounded man stood silent under the grip. The protagonist had answered the guard and endured the accusation. The street had held a brittle tension. He then walked between fallen figures and blood on the pavement, steadying himself on aching limbs. Text boxes revealed he felt like he possessed a body called Hands and held no memory of that life. He admitted he did not know why he was there, but resolved survival was most important. Darkness gathered and a pale silhouette formed behind him. He turned at that presence and registered it with a small, startled sound. The protagonist asked if that outcome would be possible, while narration warned of monsters with cunning personalities and talent in hunting. Pale eyes surfaced in the dark and wolf silhouettes coalesced, named on the page as WLFICON. The text said those wolves would take over the storage to hunt humans and noted the nearby storage had been destroyed by them. The narration framed this as the first tutorial of the Banta Black Ring. He watched the ruined yards and buildings from a distance, quiet and alert as the threat settled around him. The tutorial title declared the lesson and unsettled the protagonist briefly. He flinched at the line invoking hero Cadiz and wondered about fate. A disembodied narration promised Cadiz's journey would begin in the lesson. The protagonist acknowledged his weakness and resolved to take a single path. He launched into a sprint across ruined streets, pursuing a vague chance. The city's emptiness amplified his steps and the tutorial's cold commands. He slowed and bent over, breathing hard as the effort caught up. The protagonist moved through the ruined district, seeking shelter and study. He noted a quiet barn and declared the place perfect for his task. He slipped inside and paused to breathe, testing the air and his resolve. The room was empty, except for scattered round pellets on the floor. He crouched and examined them, thinking aloud about removing the human scent. He lifted one and held it close, gauging weight and texture with careful fingers. The gesture was practical and clinical, focused on preparation rather than comfort. He steeled himself and planned his next step with measured resolve and care. The protagonist had prepared himself and tested his resolve before exploring further. Then a distant scream split the quiet and pulled him toward immediate choice. He examined a pair of bloodied hands and felt the cost of intervention. A voice screamed for help, but he weighed risk and necessity quickly. He decided not to intervene and told himself nothing could be done. He steeled his face and focused solely on survival and escape. It was a cold calculus made necessary by his injuries. He had steeled himself to survive and refused to intervene despite earlier cries. Then frantic pleading split the room and shifted his attention outward. A figure crouched against the wall and begged for someone to save them. Low animal howls scraped the wood and cut through the silence outside. The sounds rose and fell in short, sharp bursts that frayed his restraint. He kept his cold calculus, but the noise forced him to move. He stood and approached the narrow window, then peered out to locate the source of the cries. He had withheld aid while pleas echoed, then the noise forced him to move. He rose and peered through the narrow window and found a hooded figure backlit in electric blue. A child cried out, "He's here." Captions declared the playable would raid the Wolfrican and win the Silver Moon's praise. The figure drew a glowing blade and raised a shield. The name Cadiz appeared in text. A final caption warned the tutorial boss was the king of Wolfricans. The armored wolf lifted its head and howled beneath the full moon. A caption named it Silver Mane Durkin. A hooded figure stood in cold blue light and watched from below. The figure then surged forward, charging a blinding strike that split the frame with motion lines. Energy slammed toward the wolf as cloaked features stayed hidden until a masked close-up concluded the sequence. Earlier commotion had driven the hooded presence to the rooftop for the confrontation. The hooded attacker dove from the rooftop under the full moon and struck toward the wolf. He held a long blade that traced white energy arcs as it slashed across the scene. The blow opened a bright seam of motion and packed a forceful shock through the air. The protagonist lay wounded and looked up in stunned disbelief as the strike passed. Blood and grime streaked his face, his eyes widened, and he managed a puzzled utterance. The rooftop clash remained unresolved as shadows gathered. The narration declared casualties inevitable while insisting that hero Cadiz should have survived. A fallen figure lay on the bloodstained ground as a small thought bubble asked why. The protagonist remained wounded and forced himself upright, voice strained as he said it was not over yet. He muttered that games usually had a respawn system. The rooftop clash remained unresolved as the injured protagonist searched for answers and refused to concede defeat. The wounded protagonist lay on the roof and forced a shaky laugh. He thought Cadiz would return and told himself it was only a game. Pain and blood stained his face, but he kept breathing and stayed alert. He repeated calm orders in his mind and clenched his injured hand. When he accepted that Cadiz might not come, he resolved to survive alone. He rose, pulled his cloak, and prepared to act without rescue. The rooftop fight still waited, and the answers he sought remained beyond his sight. The wounded protagonist had forced a laugh and resolved to survive alone. He told himself the tutorial still ran and that he had one more chance. He knew this world well and used his memory to guide every step. Flames and smoke consumed the distant town, while alarms and distant screams echoed over rubble. He watched bodies and a fallen sword stain the ground with blood beside broken armor. He tasted iron in his mouth and steadied his breath before moving. He pulled his cloak tighter, set his jaw, and prepared to move through the chaos. He accepted that help might not come and relied on his own skills. The wounded protagonist lifted his face to the moon and decided to try something. He knelt by a fallen blade and tasted iron on his lips. He thought of Cadiz as a character he had enjoyed playing. He reached for the sword despite blood and doubt. Light spilled from his hand as his fingers closed around the hilt. Power flowed into the blade and the air hummed. He steadied his breath and accepted that this attempt might be his only chance. He prepared to use what remained of skill and memory. The wounded protagonist moved through rain of sparks and falling debris toward the melee. He leapt across tumbling barrels and struck down with the blade he had claimed. A massive wolf-like creature charged from below, and he met it with a calm strike. Blood streaked his cheek, but memory steadied his grip, and Cadiz's lessons guided his motion. Light pooled at a pedestal where a helm gleamed in a golden spiral. Power gathered and the air hummed as he lifted the helm. He slid it over his head and sealed his resolve to fight. After he lifted the helm and sealed his resolve, the protagonist panted, clutching the sword slowly in exhaustion. He wiped blood from his cheek and peered at the blade's faint glow. The light pulsed and the blade hummed as he tested its weight. He turned toward a distant scaffolded tower and measured the empty courtyard below. A single boot tread sounded and he froze, listening for any second footfall. Moonlight carved his face and his eye narrowed at a shadowing figure. He mouthed the thought that had formed, "If I'm correct." After he removed his helm and tested the blade's faint hum, the protagonist stood on the scaffold under a cold moon. He breathed shallow and steadied the sword at his side. Below, the courtyard lay empty and silent. He smelled dust and heard a single boot tread from somewhere unseen. He shifted his weight, and the wooden planks creaked beneath his boots. Doubt flickered across his face, and he asked himself if this was the right choice. He then dismissed doubt and decided he had no choice but to seize the one chance to survive. He stepped forward and prepared to move. The beast showed its teeth and glared down with a cold stare. The dark-haired protagonist listened to the single command and looked down quietly. The command and jump echoed and filled the courtyard under the moon. He tightened his grip on the sword and clenched his jaw firmly. A purple glow pulsed along the beast's neck and threw light across its mane. The protagonist planted his foot on the scaffold edge and launched himself downward. The moon watched as steel flashed and the jump began toward a silent courtyard. The beast bared its teeth and glared down coldly. The protagonist obeyed the single command and moved without hesitation. He stepped to the scaffold edge and launched himself into the courtyard. He fell in a straight line with his sword raised overhead. Light streaked past as he dove blade first. The beast's wolf face emerged, mane flowing, expression unreadable. The purple glow along the beast's neck highlighted its features. The protagonist's jaw clenched, and he shouted a single feral command. His cry split the night as his blade drove toward the beast. The protagonist dove from the scaffold and drove his blade into the beast's neck. White fur darkened as blood sprayed, and the beast reared and roared. It thrashed violently, trying to dislodge the weapon while the protagonist held on. The wolf bucked and threw them both to the ground. After a tense tumble, the beast faltered, but then lunged again, shaking and snapping. The protagonist rose amid the chaos, holding a small red object, and asked aloud what it was. The protagonist had dove from the scaffold and driven his blade into the beast's neck. White fur had darkened, and the beast had roared while it thrashed and bucked. They had tumbled, and the protagonist had risen holding a small red object. He spat a curse and demanded what the object was with anger. The beast's yellow eye widened, and it answered with a raw, savage scream. A heavy paw struck the ground, and a short blade protruded from the beast's head. Blood splattered, and the beast coughed as it staggered forward on trembling legs. The protagonist stayed above it, gripping the red object and waiting for the end. The protagonist raised his bloodied sword beneath the full moon and shouted one more. He swung with all his strength, and the blade bit into the beast's neck and shoulder. White fur and dark blood flew as the creature collapsed against the scaffold rails. The platform splintered beneath the beast, and it tumbled through a new jagged hole into darkness. Dust and splinters rained while the protagonist stayed above, blade raised and chest heaving. Only the creature's silhouette remained visible in the pit as the night swallowed the sound. The protagonist lay on the floor, blood and dust on his face and hair. He thought his strike had failed and that the beast had survived the fall. The beast crawled forward, blood staining its fur and teeth bared in a snarl. Shattered planks and splinters lay between them under the cold night sky. A voice broke the quiet and noted there were no corpses in the warehouse. A boot stepped into frame, and the speaker said they had found them there. The protagonist lay on the floor with blood and dust matted in his hair. He thought his strike had failed and that the beast had survived the fall. A voice questioned the scene and asked if it looked like a warehouse. An unknown figure dropped into the room and swung downward at the beast. The beast lunged with bared teeth and collided with the incoming strike. Blood sprayed across the planks and splinters rained from the impact on the floor. The protagonist struggled to push himself up while an unknown red-haired figure stared wide-eyed. The unknown figure dropped a downward strike that cleaved through the beast's flank. The beast lunged and met the blade, and blood sprayed across the wooden planks. The protagonist pushed himself upright amid splinters and fog from the impact. The kneeling figure panted and stared wide-eyed with reddened hair and bloodied armor. He asked why the other did not flee as usual. He thought of Durkin and of failure if he ran. The protagonist, face smeared with blood and dust, warned him he stood no chance against Durkin. He asked again why the figure chose to stay and fight. The unknown figure had cleaved the beast's flank and met the blade. Blood sprayed across the wooden planks while the protagonist pushed himself upright. The kneeling man, hair reddened and armor bloodied, kept breathing and stared wide-eyed. He insisted he would not flee and recalled Durkin and the shame of failure. He cried that he had made a promise to himself and urged the other to live. His voice then failed. He toppled and collapsed onto the ground, bleeding. Feathers drifted upward as the camera pulled back to two small figures on a cliff. One voice demanded disbelief, while the other accused the first of wanting to run. The unknown figure had cleaved the beast and taken the blade. Blood sprayed across the planks as the protagonist pushed upright. The wounded man kept breathing and spoke of Durkin and shame. He insisted on a promise and urged the other to live before collapsing. Feathers drifted upward as the view pulled back to two small figures on a cliff. The red-haired youth vowed to grow stronger and called the other a coward. The other replied he did not care and denied being hands. He swore he would do anything, and a golden power began to rise. A ghostly figure materialized behind the protagonist as golden energy wrapped the blade. He stood with a wound across his face and gripped the glowing sword. The beast collapsed onto the deck and bled, but remained reactive. Observers announced it was already in critical condition, yet still tracked movements. Despite pain, he narrowed his eyes and saw the creature's openings. He resolved to survive as golden power rose around him. The unknown figure's presence steadied him, and the promise hung between them. A ghostly presence steadied the protagonist as golden energy wrapped the blade. He bore a fresh wound across his face and gripped the glowing sword. He traced a luminous sigil and launched himself in a low arc. The blade struck and unleashed a vertical pillar of light to the ground. The beam slammed into the beast and knocked it sprawling across the deck. It still writhed and tracked movements through pain with glowing eyes. The unknown figure's presence held a promise between them and heightened the protagonist's resolve. The protagonist's blade had landed, and a pillar of light fractured the beast's stance. The beast collapsed onto the deck and bled from multiple deep wounds. He drew a sharp breath and asked himself if it was over. The creature still twitched, and its eyes tracked faint movements around it. A final cut opened a great wound, and dark blood splattered across wood. Pain and adrenaline warped the protagonist's expression as he laughed through it. His voice rose into a raw, breathy laugh that trembled into silence. The unknown figure remained near its presence unspoken, yet binding his resolve. The protagonist had driven his blade and fractured the beast's stance on the deck. The beast collapsed with a great wound, and blood soaked the planks around them. He drew a sharp breath and laughed through pain as a raw release. The beast's eyes still tracked faint movements, and its body twitched once more. Embers floated through the moonlit town, where buildings smoked and windows glowed. An unknown figure remained nearby and held the protagonist's silence with steady presence. The protagonist wondered if the fight had truly ended. The protagonist had ended the immediate fight and later lay on a narrow bed, breathing shallow and wry as embers drifted beyond the window. The unknown figure had kept silent watch nearby while the wound throbbed. Restlessness replaced pain, and he replayed memories of Aram village. The moment he attacked the vault of Acrovenia had confirmed his long-held theory. Carved reliefs and a dark vault door lived in his thoughts. He studied a closed case and a distant shadow and wondered what had happened there and why it mattered. The protagonist had finished the fight and lay on the narrow bed, breathing shallow and wry. Embers drifted beyond the window, while the unknown figure kept silent watch nearby. Restlessness replaced pain, and he replayed memories of Aram village and the vault. He recognized carved reliefs and a dark door then in his thoughts. Now he considered the stranger's body he had become and its empty name. Inside hands he felt Cadiz's memory and swordsmanship lodged within his head. That remnant gave him a purpose despite the lack of his original identity. He flexed his fist and resolved to find what mattered in that new role. The protagonist reached out and demanded a status window from the unseen interface. He repeated commands and then swore when nothing appeared. Silence and blank space answered him. Memories of the vault and carved reliefs lingered in his mind. Days passed as he moved through the village asking questions and gathering scraps of information. Morning light later found him in the same narrow bed where he stretched and rubbed his face. He prepared to stand and follow the lights he had collected during those days. The protagonist had moved through the village and gathered fragments of information. He woke in the same narrow bed and readied himself to follow lights. Before a mirror he judged how this world differed from what he knew. He considered the possibility of different types of heroes living here. He lifted a battered helmet and felt its weight settle on his head. Lowering the visor, an image and a name formed in his mind. The name read Pavel's Kodvan, and he accepted it as a mantle. He straightened and prepared to move forward under that new identity. The protagonist had already taken the name Pavel's Kodvan and moved to observe the inn. He confirmed that Pavel stayed in the same building as him that morning. The hooded figure knocked and then pushed the door open with a hard bang. A pale man in a teal cloak stumbled into the doorway, rubbing his brow. He moaned and spoke the name Pavel's Kodvan as if testing the claim. The hooded figure's helmeted face registered only question marks and silent confusion. No answer followed, so both men paused in tense, uncertain silence. The protagonist had adopted the name Pavel's Kodvan and had stayed at the inn. A hooded figure had forced open the door and confronted him with silence. The stranger then laid a feast on the table and offered it as apology. Pavel smiled and blushed, refusing politely, then yielding to the invitation. He quietly stated he could not decline such clear hospitality. Inwardly he confessed a single goal, to become this man's comrade. They ate together, meat and bread passing between them in measured bites. The shared meal closed the scene and hinted at an emerging bond. The hooded stranger had tested Pavel's Kodvan about joining the large-scale Antro subjugation. He called Pavel's a mercenary and asked why he had not left with the others. Pavel's answered questions with a calm face and a brief question of his own about the stranger's interest. He tapped the table once to punctuate the pause. The stranger noted the town's departure and Pavel's choice to remain. Pavel's admitted he shared similar reasons for staying. He laughed and dismissed the campaign as leaderless and doomed. The conversation ended without commitment and implied a fragile understanding between them. Pavel's Kodvan smiled and asked if the stranger aimed for the cash prize. The hooded unknown figure answered no and refused any interest in money. He said he sought a strong combat companion capable of subjugating Antro. He privately admitted his real need was a shield, not a partner for glory. He planned to solve Pavel's Kodvan's financial problems to secure the man's cooperation. Pavel's watched and smiled and appeared motivated by clear financial need now. The hooded man resolved to buy loyalty rather than beg allegiance. Pavel's Kodvan examined the coins and smiled at the offered payment with quiet interest. He noted the man's wealth and admitted he preferred to work alone for now. The unknown figure refused simple partnership and insisted he sought a capable combat companion. He clarified his need was a shield and that money would buy Pavel's cooperation. Pavels accepted the conditional offer in silence and said he would consider the plan. They left the tavern view, and the scene cut to distant mountains shrouded in fog. Pavel's Kodven had accepted the conditional offer and left the tavern toward fogged mountains. They moved onward into a sparse forest where the protagonist clarified his aims. The protagonist said he did not want to save the world and sought only survival. He would serve as Pavel's Kodven's companion and ask only a safe place to live. He trusted Pavel's Kodven to protect his body and carry the hero's burden. Pavel's Kodven was shown setting traps and planning dungeon strategies in silence. Others had labeled him an easy difficulty character within the game. Pavel's Kodven had agreed to the conditional offer and led them toward fogged mountains. They moved into a sparse forest where the protagonist stated his goal plainly. He said he did not aim to save the world, but to survive and serve Pavels. He asked only for shelter and trusted Pavels to bear the hero's burden. Pavels prepared traps and mapped dungeon routes in silence as others labeled him easy difficulty. At the forest route, Pavels warned of approaching Antros and wished the protagonist luck before departing. They reached a glade where a colossal tree creature loomed over roots and mist. The beast exhaled low breaths as small wraiths circulated near its base. An armored, hooded figure lingered at the tree line and considered staying to watch the emerging threat. He paused, then sighed and gripped his cloak while weighing risk and duty. Suddenly, a swift, ranged attack cut through the air and struck the creature's red eye. The beast recoiled with a roar and vines lashed outward toward the attacker. They reached a glade where a colossal tree creature loomed among roots and mist. The beast exhaled and small wraiths swirled at its base. An armored, hooded figure lingered at the tree line and weighed risk and duty. Then a ranged bolt struck the creature's red eye, and it recoiled as vines lashed outward. Cadiz moved along a high branch, knocked his crossbow, and said he needed at least 3 shots. He fired precise bolts that traced red beams and struck the eye and nearby flesh. The beast roared and its vines snapped toward the perches. Cadiz had fired precise bolts into the beast's red eye moments before. The beast's vines had already snapped toward the perches. It tore open its maw, its red eye flaring as a dark tendril lashed out. The tendril struck a perched combatant and sent them tumbling through rain. They fell past splintered wood and grabbed for their staff as they fell. On the ground, they checked a palm stone and muttered about how much they had spent. A close view named it Stone of Red Flowers and said it would explode. The unknown figure spoke and said they shared the same idea as Pavel's Kodven. Cadiz had already struck the beast's red eye and watched its tendrils lash at perches moments earlier. A perched combatant fell through rain and grabbed for their staff. On the ground, the palm stone was checked and named Stone of Red Flowers, and its imminent explosion was feared. An unknown figure voiced the same plan as Pavel's Kodven. In the panels, Cadiz seized the red stone and planted her feet. She funneled energy through her staff until concentric rings of light wrapped the gem. A vertical beam drove into the stone, and the gem detonated in a blinding blast. Cadiz had already poured power into the red stone when the gem cracked open. Fractures spidered across its surface with sudden sparks as inner light flared. Small orbiting motes detached and drifted upward in the ruined space. The motes traced a path to a face hunched in shadow that revealed a single red eye. The visage bared a cruel grin and registered age and malice. Cadiz's channeling culminated in a focused burst into the stone. The gem detonated in a blinding eruption that consumed nearby forms and erupted into fire. Smoke and sparks filled the air, and silence followed the blast. After the gem detonated, a muffled voice whispered Pavel's name through ash and sparks. A wounded figure lay gasping beneath drifting motes and ember. Sparks and ember drifted slowly, while silence settled over the ruined chamber. The hooded masked observer stepped from shadow and noted the blast exceeded expectation. The unknown figure judged that at this rate Antro could be cleared without resistance. He spoke with a distant, measured tone that suggested approval. He concluded Pavel's Kodven would rise from the wreckage and become the hero. After the gem detonated, a muffled whisper named Pavel's amid ash and sparks. He lay gasping while ember drifted through the ruined chamber. The hooded observer stepped from shadow and noted the blast exceeded expectation. He judged Antro could be cleared without resistance and expected Pavel's Kodven to rise. Pavel's forced himself upright and grasped a blade, scanning the darkness. His focus frayed and his face went pale. Something answered the silence. A blackened maw opened, and a hulking beast with burning eyes loomed. Pavel's Kodven stood with his back to the maw and watched smoke curl upward. Embers drifted among streaks of shadow that fell in vertical dark lines. A hulking maw opened above, and the creature revealed burning eyes and jagged teeth. Feathers and ash rained down and struck the floor with dull taps. A bucket overturned and scattered white kernels across the scorched cold stone. Pavel's braced his grip on the blade and felt his focus crack. He muttered a raw curse and admitted the scene had become unbearable. The chamber closed to a hush as a distant title burned into night. Pavel's Kodven had watched the maw and the black smoke curl upward in silence. After the battle, a corpse lay half hidden beneath scorched armor and spilled embers. He muttered that Cadiz had died and searched his memory for weakness. Pavel's had shown no weakness, but his blade had failed at the worst moment. He lifted his hooded face and called the failure absurd with a low voice. A shallow breath escaped, and the silence settled around the ruined hall. Pavel's braced himself for what followed. Pavel's Kodven had been left half-hidden beneath scorched armor after the blast. He had muttered at his blade's failure and felt the silence settle in the ruined hall. A massive, red-eyed Antro regarded the ruin. A cloaked fighter stepped forward with a drawn sword and resolved to test Antro. He admitted Pavel's was dead and accepted the risk. He trusted Cadiz's swordsmanship as their only chance. The fighter moved with tight control and closed the distance. Antro bared its jaws and prepared to strike. The cloaked fighter dropped down and sliced in a wide, controlled arc toward Antro. He reminded himself that two more things were needed to win. First, he named Pavel's bag with the stone of red flowers and scanned the ruined floor. He reached for the bag as his blade traced light. Antro's dark tendrils whipped through the air and met the strike.